Hey guys, Kroski here, and for my first video on this channel, I'm going to be doing an analysis of a Crazy House match which took place a week ago in the Crazyhouse Weekly Tournament number 5, I believe it was, hosted by BitChess. And this is going to be a match featuring JannLee with the white pieces, rated an impressive 28-42 at the time, against Mastertan, 27-66 at the time. And both of these players are elite Crazy House players, among the best in the world. And I actually found this match on JannLee's stream, and it struck me as being particularly compelling. So I thought I'd do an analysis of it. It offers an awful lot by way of both chess and Crazy House strategy and themes. So let's jump into it. JannLee starts with e4, his customary king's pawn opening, and Mastertan, in standard Mastertan fashion, does not meet that with 1e5, as many players do. He instead opts for a less conventional approach, knight c6. And what's interesting about this move is, you see over here, I have in my database, the opening database, which is a handy tool in Lichess, by the way, games rated 2200 and above on all time controls. And you can see that knight c6 actually scores very well against 1e4, surprisingly, and is employed a fair amount. It's the fourth highest played move, or most frequently played move, against 1e4. So it's not necessarily bad. It's a decent idea, decent approach. And as I said in my Reddit post, what it's doing is it's controlling some valuable central real estate, while not yet committing either of these two pawns to one of these four squares. So it's very flexible. You're not yet telling your opponent what you're going to do about the center, with the drawback of the fact that you're delaying the development of your kingside pieces, which can be very important. I find in Crazy House, you want to get these two pieces in particular out and into the game normally as fast as possible, so that you can castle and get your king to safety. That said, this is perfectly playable. So JannLee decides, because Mastertan has not yet claimed any central presence with these pawns, he's gonna make a big center and ask Mastertan how he's going to challenge it. So 1e4, knight c6, d4, and d5 from Mastertan, committing this d pawn and telling JannLee that this is how he's going to fix the center. So there are a few options at this point. You could capture, or you could push past, and I suppose you could try to defend this pawn, but that's probably going to fail because this pawn will fall after this is captured. For example, if you try to play knight c3 guarding this pawn, black can just capture, and after capture, this pawn is going to hang. So that's probably not ideal. So your two main options really are capturing and pushing past, and both are committal. Both are. This is going to lead to a much more open game, much more tactical game, because you're opening up lines and you're getting black's queen into the center very quickly, but also reducing your central presence a little bit. And this is going to lead to a more closed game. So just a quick variation which is possible is takes, and you can't yet kick the queen with tempo as you'd like to, because this pawn will hang. So you have to defend this first, and this is a perfectly viable move. This is a perfectly viable move. But I think black should be perfectly happy in a position like this, because he has equal development to white, maybe even accelerated development, because after this move he's going to have 3 pieces deployed to white's 1, 2 if you count the queen and some open lines. But nonetheless, black is perfectly fine here out of the opening, so he should be happy with the setup. Okay, so JannLee decided to push past and fix this pawn structure. You'll see these pawns aren't really going to do much for the rest of the game, or for a while anyway. It's a very fixed pawn structure, and that really sets the whole complexion for the course of the game. Now a6 from Mastertan. This is a very intriguing move. This is not a move I would normally play. This is not a move I normally see played at any level really, except the very lowest levels. But it's curious that Mastertan is playing this because he's contending this square is so valuable to white that black needs to defend it. What's more, because the center is locked up, Mastertan is contending that he has time to play this queenside pawn move, which doesn't seem too constructive on face value. He's contending that white is not going to be able to open up the position enough and get enough pieces deployed to mount an attack, really, before black can deploy his own pieces. And I think there's something to be said about that. I think he may be right. So he wants to stop this bishop from coming here, namely putting some pressure on this knight, which can be uncomfortable at times. For example, if you get a bishop out here and then you trade for a pawn, say, I don't know, like just for example, play some dumb moves here, and you get a pawn in hand, it can be a little bit uncomfortable for black if white can place his pawn here, because if you capture, then white's going to win material. So that's the first reason, I suppose, why a6 is played. But also a secondary reason is later in the game, it's stopping a knight from getting here, which can cause some problems, especially with this pawn on e5. Because this pawn is going to always want to come to e6 to make room for this bishop. I don't think in this scenario you're really going to want to fianchetto. It's possible, but e6 is the most reasonable, most standard way to get this bishop deployed. And when you play e6, you're going to give up control of the d6 square. And that's important because if a knight were to get to this square and you've played e6, a knight could capture here and cause some problems for you. If you can envision this, with a knight here, this pawn deployed on e6, and a bishop on e7, you could sack this knight here, the queen's going to recapture, and then you place that pawn here, forking these two pieces. And what that means is you're going to get your material back for that knight sack, while also making some serious inroads into black's dark square territory. So that's what this pawn move is doing, this strange pawn move, which is somewhat effective actually. It's stopping a bishop or a knight from getting to this square. Alright, next few moves are pretty standard development moves. Knight f3 guarding these two central pawns, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain before you play e6. Some more standard development moves, king gets to safety. And Mastertan makes a somewhat prophylactic move, bringing the bishop back to g6 before it's even hit. And I suppose he's just shoring up defenses. He doesn't want this, for example, knight to swing out here and to capture on f5 and disrupt his pawn structure. And it's just a little bit safer here, tucked away, guarded by these pawns, and also defending the king side nicely. Bishop f4, more standard development, knight e7. This knight's looking to swing into f5, which is a pretty standard French type maneuver. And f5, it's going to sit very nicely on f5. c3 shoring up this central construction, or pawn center, pawn formation. And notice if black had a pawn in hand, this, or if there's tension in the center of pawns, perhaps like if they're facing off here and could be captured for a pawn, or pawns could be traded, this would be a very bad idea because you're creating a weakness on c2. And so if black had a pawn in hand, he could drop that pawn on c2, forking these two pieces and winning significant material. But this game is quite interesting because it breaks a few standard Crazyhouse motifs or rules of thumb or heuristics. It breaks a few Crazyhouse rules, really, and it's a fascinating game because of that. Normally, a move like moving your c-pawn when your queen is on d1 and knight on b1 is still undeveloped, is not a great idea, and you'll find out later in the game there's some even more unorthodox pawn moves like f5 and a few more interesting lines like that, which get played because of this e5 move on move, what was it? Move 3 it was, all the way back on move 3, e5, locking things up. And so a lot of moves that wouldn't otherwise be possible are possible, and actually a good idea to play because things are locked up and nothing is able to be traded yet. There's no tension in the position, Nothing to be traded at least for another 2 moves. And there's no really pawn breaks to be made except perhaps c4, but then again, you make yourself susceptible to that pawn being captured and then placed. So everything's locked up. It's going to be a very strategic first 15-20 moves. Okay, so c3, good move. Shoring up this d4 pawn. Knight jumps out to f5, and now we are fully developed. Okay. Queen b3, and this is the point I said in my Reddit post, which is really the first somewhat committal move. White is saying that there's not yet really any headway to be made on the king side. The position is still so locked, and no trades have been made, and the king is going to be pretty safe once it gets to, behind these pawns, once it gets castled. So he's just bringing his queen into the action on the queen side, and placing a little bit of pressure on this b7 pawn. And this was his last undeveloped piece. You could contend that these are undeveloped, but rooks normally don't get developed in Crazyhouse until much later, as in chess. So he's getting his queen active, and bringing some pressure to the queen side, playing on both sides of the board. Black defends this pawn. You do want to defend this pawn. You don't want that to fall, because then your light squares become quite weak. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure. I've thought about this a bit. I'm not entirely sure why the rook comes to a7 as opposed to b8. And I think it would be perfectly well placed on b8. You keep this coordination between the queen and the rook, and when you get castled, then everything's going to be connected on this back rank. So I would just leave it here in the back rank. I suppose Black could have been looking many moves into the future, and maybe being a little bit worried about a pawn being placed here eventually, driving his rook away and making this pawn open to capture once his knight is not defending that square. So maybe that's why he played it to a7 instead of to b7, just filling this gap in his position. Oh, and one thing I did want to mention is, okay, so we're on move 10 right now, but if we go back a few moves and take a look at this opening database over here, we see that this position has been played multiple times, notably by Mastertan a lot. He seems to like this setup with a knight c6 and d5 and a6, bishop coming out to f5, and as soon as we get to this move, we are already in novel territory. This position has never been seen before, and we're just past move 6. We're on move 7 has just been played, bishop f4, and this is completely uncharted territory. This game is the only game in the database in which this position has been achieved, which is probably one of the reasons Mastertan likes to play these types of setups, because it gets into novel territory quite early, and gets you out of what could be called theory or book. There's a lot of quote-unquote theory or book revolving around e4, e5. You get very standard positions like that, and even to a lesser extent, there's a fair amount of theory with d4 as well. But with this knight c6, you're venturing into novel territory, and again, by move 7, you're in a completely new position. Very interesting. So everything from here on out, the players are coming up with on the spot. And one more thing I should mention is that this is a blitz game. It's 3 + 0, the time control, so 3 minutes with 0 increment, and that will come into play. That will be important, especially later in the game when JannLee in particular, with the white pieces, gets into some significant time trouble. All right, so after rook a7, now this is another, I don't want to say turning point, but point at which JannLee and Mastertan show their class. They recognize that the position is still so closed that there's no immediate urgency. There's no need to try to rush things, and there's actually significant time to improve your pieces and get them to the most efficient and optimized squares before you start making any pawn breaks, like maybe c4 in the future, although this pawn would hang right now, or figuring out a plan to mount an attack, but it's not necessary right now. And so I would probably make a mess out of this and try to rush headlong into an attack, maybe with rook e1, trying to swing this knight around, guarding this pawn, breaking with c4 eventually, making some trades and dropping on the king side. And that's why I'm not nearly as good as these guys, is because they recognize when the position calls for tactical type play, aggressive play, and when it doesn't. When strategic, slow, grinding positional play is more precise. And so that's what JannLee does right now. There's really no headway to be made again yet in the position. Everything is still so locked up, again, with this central pawn formation being so locked. King h1, getting the king to safety. Although that safety may be incremental, may be very subtle, it's somewhat significant, especially in later stages when more pieces, more pawns get traded off. First of all, you're getting your king off this diagonal, which isn't so important right now with a bishop on e7. But in many games of Crazyhouse, a bishop eventually makes its way to this long diagonal, and f2 can often become a tender point for a sack, or it's pinned with a bishop on this diagonal, or queen sometimes. And so bringing your king off that diagonal onto h1 can be useful. So this pawn can move and can capture if it needs to. And by putting your king on h1, you're getting it out of range of some nasty tricks involving knight checks on h3 or f3. Obviously, neither of which are possible in the near future, but they could be important later on. So king h1, getting out of those knight checks, stepping out of this long diagonal, and just putting it into the corner where it's going to be nice and safe in this little box. King h1, Mastertan does likewise and gets his king to safety, castles. And rook g1, just continuing this plan of improving his pieces very slowly, very surely, and creating this little box around his king. Knight h4, this knight doesn't really need to be taken. Mastertan doesn't really yet have anything to do, so I guess he's just making this move to possibly introduce some tension into the position and make the possibility of a trade kind of looming in the air. If white were to take this, it's okay, it's fine. This pawn becomes a little bit weaker, I suppose. It's under fire with this bishop, and you have to be a little bit careful that you don't blunder mate with something like this. If you want to keep this little box around your king, whoops, you've just hung mate, smother mate. That would be embarrassing, but you could recapture with the h-pawn, but this is fine. You're in no immediate danger, but you're making a few weaknesses, a few concessions on the king side. You're opening up this file, and f2 is still weak, so rather than taking that knight, it doesn't need to be taken. If black ever captures here, you can just recapture, get this knight into the action, or you could recapture with the bishop, but probably with the knight. And so yeah, this doesn't really do too much. I think it's okay to leave it there and just ask black what he's going to do about that. So JannLee continues his plan, getting his pieces into optimal positions. And now the pressure has been very, very slowly but surely building. As I say in my Reddit post, it's been building into a crescendo, and now Mastertan finally decides it's time to make somewhat of a breakout move. And this is one of the turning points of the game. So thus far, it's been a very strategical, very grinding, very positional type game, very patient game. With no open lines, everything's closed. Pieces are slowly getting into the action. Pieces are slowly being accumulated on the king side. And now Mastertan introduces the possibility of things becoming slightly more open. So what this pawn move is accomplishing is it's controlling a lot more very valuable squares, valuable real estate on white's king side over here in this box of 16 squares. E4 will be a very important point to control, as well as g4, because if you can get more pawns in these squares, you're going to have a very strong light square presence, and can eventually keep placing pawns and making inroads into the white position on those squares. Even a knight here would be a beautiful outpost for a knight or a bishop or any piece, really. And so I don't think white wants to allow this pawn just to stay here and allow the position to remain so closed, and black can trade on his own terms, and black's actually controlling more territory than white is at this point. You can see black's controlling these squares on white's light square complex, and white is only controlling these two squares on black's dark square complex. So black would be sitting just fine there. He'd be very happy with that position he's achieved if this pawn is allowed to stay advanced on f5. Notice that f5 is not normally a move you see played this late in the middle game in a game of Crazyhouse, because it significantly weakens the e6 square and makes this diagonal a little bit weaker, which can be normally exploited to devastating effect in Crazyhouse when pieces can be placed along this diagonal, when pieces, let's say a knight could be placed on one of these squares attacking this, something like that. But again, because the game is so closed, this is a perfectly reasonable move to make, because there's no means readily available of attacking that tender e6 square. There's no way JannLee can exploit the fact that black is advancing this f-pawn and giving up a little bit of control on these light squares. So I think f5, good move. Very interesting move, good move. So that more or less should be taken, I think. I think capturing there is the right decision. And in doing so, he makes this weakness on e6 more concrete than it would have been if things had remained closed, with this pawn blocking things off and no access to the e6 square. There's no way you can really put pressure on that. So he makes this weakness a little bit more egregious, and makes sure black can't control these squares, while at the same time allowing black a little bit more activity. You can see his bishop is getting into the action. Beforehand, his bishop was fine on this diagonal, but it wasn't very active. And it's slightly more active on here, exerting a little bit more control over this square. And also opening up this line for the rook. So you can see whenever black moves his bishop, then there will be pressure on the f4 square. This bishop is unguarded, so it will be hanging. So now things are very slowly but surely heating up. That's for certain. So now both players have a pawn in hand, and so no exchanges were made this entire game until move 14. E takes f6 on move 14, which is remarkable for a game of Crazyhouse. You'll normally see trades well before this, so this almost looks like a chess game. It could have been a chess game before this point. So now, pawn at g5. There are a couple options. You could play pawn at e5 or pawn at g5. And I think the pawn was placed at g5 to sever the coordination between this battery of pieces, the queen and bishop, and the knight. So, for example, if black doesn't address that and just drops his bishop back to save that piece, this knight will hang. So you have to address that first. Mastertan does, and captures. White recaptures with the knight, bringing this piece, which wasn't doing too much on d2, back into the action. And now we have even more pieces in the pocket. Things are certainly heating up. Bishop drops back, getting out of dodge from this pawn, also unleashing the rook on this bishop and asking white what he's going to do about this. Now, white does have a tactic available here, and JannLee spent a few seconds thinking about this, whether or not to pull the trigger on this. And to be honest, in retrospect, after knowing the result of this game and how it panned out, I can't say whether it was the correct decision or not. You do have to do something about this bishop. And well, just to show you, this is how the game proceeds. he takes on c7, which creates some weaknesses on the dark squares. Sacks his bishop, but you immediately get the material back by placing a pawn at g6. So JannLee decides to pinch that rook, which is kind of dangling over here in the corner, with no apparent destination and no real job, really, rather than guarding b7. Which is why, actually, I think this move is somewhat questionable. Essentially, you're trading this bishop for a pawn and a rook. Really just a rook. It's a bishop for a rook. And this scenario, well, in most scenarios, rather, bishops and rooks are, minor pieces and rooks are roughly equivalent in Crazyhouse. So that said, I don't think trading this bishop for this rook is a great idea. You will get a rook in hand, but this bishop is much more valuable to white's position than this rook is to black's position, because it's just so much more active. It's placed much more, near to the action. It's on the king side. It's guarding this pawn. It's guarding the king side. It has this nice diagonal. This is also a very nice diagonal to control, because you do pressurize the c7 square. If you ever get, say, another bishop you could place on this diagonal and create a battery, it can get into the action a lot quicker, and it's a valuable defensive piece as well. This rook, again, is doing nothing, really. It's not doing anything besides guarding this b7 pawn, which is really completely out of the action at this stage in the game. So, not a terrible idea by any means, but one which is less than ideal, I think. Perhaps a better move would be just to drop the bishop back while still keeping an eye on this pawn. I suppose it would even be possible to give this pawn up, drop this bishop back to b3, and after a few captures, you get to place your pieces with tempo. The black queen is not going to be too comfortable. It's not going to have too many squares that it can sit comfortably, maybe here, but you're getting a lot of tempo, getting your pieces into the action at the price of a pawn. I think that's okay. So maybe one of those two moves, just holding on to this bishop instead of giving or trading it for this rook in the corner on a7, it might have been preferable in retrospect. So takes, and pawn at b6, and here we reach the real turning point in the game. And I'm going to give you a few seconds here to see if you can figure out what's played next without looking at the side. I know it's on the notation, and I think I might have actually skipped through it when I was playing through some of those moves, but so by now you've had a few seconds. But Mastertan realizes that he's going to have to give up a significant amount of material in return for this bishop he's nabbed on c7. He's going to lose either the queen or the rook. And most players would move the queen away, myself included. I would certainly just move the queen away and maybe bring it even into the action on f4. Maybe just drop it back to d8. Probably not d7, where it can be attacked by drop knight with tempo. Probably wouldn't want to do that. But I think d8 or f4 would be fine. Just getting the queen out of range of this pawn and giving this rook up, that's fine. You can always recapture with the knight if you want to. Otherwise, that pawn doesn't need to be captured immediately. This rook will guard the queening square, and white's not really threatening too much. You can do something else with your time rather than recapturing, or you could recapture and start placing that pawn elsewhere. But Mastertan comes up with a brilliant move here. A speculative sacrifice, which, given the time controls, I think is a very good practical decision, a very interesting sacrifice for a very almost imperceptible positional advantage. His move, if you haven't seen it already, let's see if you've been able to come up with this, is queen takes h2, exclam. Now, JannLee was a little bit confused about this. I think when I was watching his stream, he seemed a little bit puzzled at first. He wasn't expecting this, kind of came out of left field, and I would react the same. I would not be expecting a move like that. Mastertan, instead of giving up the rook, is giving up the whole queen for a pawn. And what he's contending with this move, what he's trying to accomplish with this queen sacrifice, which looks dubious at best, really, on first inspection, is, well, first of all, white is not going to be able to do anything with this queen in hand, even though he's going to be up so much material. The position is still so closed, and black's king is still so safe, and the game is still progressing at such a measured and deliberate pace. Things haven't yet been blown wide open, that white can't really do anything with that queen. There's no square it can be placed where it can make any ingress into the black position. He's not going to be dropping mate anytime soon. He can't drop any pawns to exploit his dark squares. He can't really do much to make inroads. So this queen is not going to be able to be used. He's just going to have it sitting in his pocket. In the meantime, black has managed, with this queen sacrifice, giving up all this material, to make white's position creak ever so slightly. You have knight at g4 ideas with tempo. You have increased control over the dark square complex. Without this pawn on h2, g3 becomes a little bit more tender, and white's king becomes a little bit more open. Along this file, there's no more pawn blocking that file off, and again, it's not much. It's really not much for the queen, which is why this is such a spectacular move. It's a positional sacrifice. A queen for a pawn? Well, a queen for a bishop, really, after the bishop was sacked here. But for positional considerations, notice you can't well, you could recapture with this knight, but then this pawn will hang, so JannLee decides to take with the king, continuing his control over that square, and this is a pretty valuable pawn for white. It's his only piece or pawn guarding or attacking squares in black's position. So he takes with the king, and he, like I would, felt quite safe, I think. Black doesn't really have too much to follow up with that. Only this very slight, again, like I said, almost imperceptible positional edge. So black proceeds, gaining more control over the dark squares. Remember, this pawn not being on h2 means that black is going to want to proceed on the dark squares, most notably by probably placing a pawn eventually on g3. And so that's what this does. You don't have to address this right away if you can place this with tempo, as Mastertan does. So the king drops back, and now you don't want to drop that rook, so it drops back to a8. Now at e5, pretty good move. You're blocking off this diagonal and also introducing a piece into black's half of the board finally. So this is a good move. It's a good piece, a good knight. And consequently, Mastertan does the same. He introduces his own knight into white's half of the board. Queen at h4. Now this is probably a good move. It's an interesting move. You're getting this queen out of your pocket and into the game, and you're guarding a lot of important squares, which might otherwise be a little bit susceptible to maybe this rook, which is controlling some squares, and this pawn has come under fire twice from the bishop and the knight. So the queen coming to h4, being dropped onto the board, instead of just sitting in the pocket, it is somewhat valuable because you're making sure your king is nice and safe, and a lot of these squares are guarded with this queen on h4. But it's committal. Well, it's both committal by placing your queen on the board and getting it out of the pocket, so it can no longer be placed near to the king or somewhere where it might have a little bit more immediate effect, immediate threats. Because I guess to adapt a standard phrase, a queen in the hand is maybe worth more than one in the bush, so to speak. Maybe a queen in the pocket is a little bit more valuable than a queen which is already committed on the board, especially when it's not committed in such a very active place. I'd say it's active here, but not as active as it could otherwise be if things open up. So it both does that, and the second drawback is that it makes it a target. So black is going to be able to place some pieces onto the board and attack this queen with tempo while gaining space, and that's going to be important. So after queen h4, Mastertan capitalizes on that. So he captures white's best placed piece, this knight on e5, which again is the only knight controlling significant black territory. So he axes that. White recaptures with the d-pawn, trying to gain a little bit more control over the f6 square, I think. And also, he doesn't yet want to trade off more material, I think. Because now black is going to have a huge initiative, I think. He's going to be able to place a lot of stuff with tempo. And again, this queen isn't so very well placed if that happens. So he captures with the pawn, saying x-nay to more trades. And now black is again going to place his knight on probably the optimal square in this position. Attacking the queen with tempo. So you're placing with tempo, which is always very important in Crazyhouse, as in chess. Tempo, that is. And at the same time, you're controlling these dark squares, which is going to prove very, very important. So look how beautiful both of these knights are. Look how well they're placed, and look how well they complement each other. They're going to be attacking these dark squares and exerting significant pressure along this complex. So all these squares are going to come under fire very, very quickly. White has to move this queen, unless you want to drop the queen, which would not be ideal, obviously. And then black's going to be able to place a pawn and start tearing open white's position. So knight at f5, great move. Black is slowly starting to turn the screws. You can see how this queen sack, which on first glance, it looks dubious at best. But this dark square weakness has slowly been cranked up from a low simmer into something that could be called a boil right now. And it's going to slowly, well, not slowly, it's actually going to burst into life very shortly. So queen h3, and now pawn at g3. And this is where the tide really starts to turn. This queen has been placed on the board, so it's no longer in the pocket where it can be placed to greater effect. Black has slowly built up a lot more space and a lot more activity on the king side, whereas he was getting pushed around a little bit. Say maybe in the opening where he had to make this rook move on the queen side, and white had more space. White slowly gaining space on the king side as well. White has this tactic, but now the entire course of the game has changed with this sacrifice. You can see how things heat up awfully quickly, and black turns the entire tide of the game around. And now look at all the space he's claimed. Look at the initiative he's claimed. Great move, this queen at h2. Great practical sacrifice, I think. And now, around this point, white is in serious time pressure. I think, if I recall correctly, I was watching the stream, he has like, I want to say 15 seconds on his clock, or maybe at up to 30 seconds, but somewhere in that range, and that's very unpleasant to have such little time on your clock when you're trying to defend accurately and trying to make very precise defensive moves. If you don't have the luxury of a lot of time to think, your position can collapse awfully quickly, I think. And so that was another aspect of the beauty of this queen takes h2 move, is you're making white burn a lot of time. Again, Crazyhouse is a very practical game. Almost all Crazyhouse games are played in 3+0 or less time controls, so it's always going to be a blitz or bullet game. So if you can manage to make interesting moves, tactical moves, which may not be the best. Who knows whether or not that queen takes h2 line was the best, but which make your opponent think, puts them under pressure, makes them burn some time, makes them a little bit confused, puts them out of unfamiliar territory, which all these things I'm saying I think is the way Mastertan likes to play. I'm finding more and more. Then you're going to be doing awfully well, I think. So again, great practical sack. Okay, moving on. White is hard pressed to defend here already. He's really, these moves are maybe they're not 100% precise, but they're more or less forced. You've got to start placing more pieces on these dark squares to shore things up, but nonetheless, you're going to be losing material. You're going to be losing ground as these pawns coming into the heart of white's position. Here, JannLee replaces this pawn at h2, but really it's not going to be enough. Black still has so much control over these dark squares, and he's going to be getting that material back awfully quickly. So he recaptures here, knowing that after the recapture he can bring this knight in, and that has to be taken because otherwise you're just picking up the queen. So I think Black has already regained that material that he initially sacrificed. You're going to be getting even more material back here, and White is completely on the back foot. At f3, that gets captured. White knows that he can capture with the knight because Black has no knight in hand, and he can't capture any more knights on the board. There's no knight dangling out that he can exchange to place on f2, which would be mate. So capturing and putting your king into a potentially smothered position is fine here. Black has no ready means of getting a knight to f2. Bishop at e3. Again, good move, putting more pressure on these dark squares, but also pressurizing the g5 square even quicker. This pawn doesn't need to be picked up immediately, so I think that's a good move. Pawn at f6. This is going to be a little bit too little, too late. This is a somewhat artificial threat, honestly. Black's just going to draw your king out, and now this pawn structure can be addressed pretty summarily. So Black rather just cuts off the base of that little pawn triangle here, and after you capture, well, after you throw this pawn sack in to draw the king out even further, remember there's very little time on the clock right now. You can just recapture, and your king is quite safe. This also comes with check, by the way, so White has to block this check somehow or move the king, but White really doesn't have nearly enough attacking resources around the Black king to make significant headway, and Black realizes this, so he's making practical moves. He's moving fast and putting White under a lot of strain. White's going to lose on time. He's going to get flagged. So notice one thing that of course flits through your mind when you're defending a position like this is you want to make sure that you don't get smothered. But really, Black is in no threat of being smothered right now, because even though White has a knight in hand, which can be placed at h6, it's just going to be a check. There's nothing that's going to come of it, because again, this queen is on the board. It's no longer in hand. Standard motif you'll see is a knight placed here, the king will go here, queen placed here, rook takes, and the knight will move to f7, if you can envision all that, and that will be a smothered mate, because the king has no squares to go to. But again, first of all, White has no rook or queen in hand, and Black has his square well guarded, well defended by the knight and the bishop, even if the rook moves. So yeah, this check does nothing. Black is in no real danger here, and also this comes with check. So he blocks a check, and now Black places the last of his pieces onto the board, and the game is going to be over very shortly. The king ends up on f4, and the game ends here after a check, and the king sidesteps neatly into the side, where it's quite safe, and the game ends with a flag. JannLee runs out of time, and I think Mastertan still had a lot of time on the clock, but again, Black is winning on the board. Black's king is quite safe, while White's king is quite exposed, and I think the material balance is, even if it's not in Black's favor, which it might well be, he has more than enough material to place on the board with serious threats. Rook's coming to e4, and yeah, after rook comes e4, actually, the game is going to be over in short order, I think. So, White flags. Again, I think Black was winning on the board, but nonetheless, it was a fantastic game, starting with this queen takes h2 move on move, what was it, 18. So that changed the entire complexion of the game. f5 and queen takes h2 moves of the game. Brilliant moves from Mastertan, making practical decisions, putting JannLee under a lot of pressure, making him burn time, putting him under pressure both on the board and on the clock, having a masterful understanding of positional and tactical concepts, knowing when to be aggressive, when not to be aggressive, when to improve your pieces, when to get your king to safety, and when finally to break out. when the time is ripe to break out and make things a little bit more open, a little bit more tactical, make things a little bit more wild. And so I think, again, I think both players exhibited that to a fine degree. So yeah, there you have it. Just as one last overview, let's scroll all the way back to the beginning. Started with e4 and went into novel territory very quickly with this kind of unorthodox setup that Mastertan likes to employ. a6 guarding this square, very interesting opening decisions by Mastertan, and the game gets very locked up. Positional, still positional. White's going to improve his king side. Black's going to do the same. And now this committal move f5, opening the position a little bit. White decides to accept and open the position. Now a few pieces get exchanged, and Black makes the decision to go for this brilliant queen sack. Drawing the king out, dark square presence gets exploited. Queen gets placed, more pieces get placed on White's half of the board, pushing him back, trading along these dark squares and making all these massive weaknesses, all these massive holes. And then it does devolve into a time scramble in the end, but well played by both players. So that was kind of the trajectory of the game in a nutshell. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks to JannLee for streaming this, and thanks to Mastertan for putting on an excellent display of Crazyhouse brilliance. And hope you guys enjoyed this.